Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the sixth HERA and final webinar of this current series entitled Rethinking Knowledge Exchange within the Humanities. My name is Tony Whiten, and along with Professor Joseph Fair, I work as a Knowledge Exchange and Impact Fellow for HERA. Now, Knowledge Exchange forms an integral part of the HERA Joint Research Programme, and over the past 10 years, projects working within this programme have established an impressive range of international partnerships, collaborations, and research has been undertaken in collaboration with associated partners from different industries and cultural sectors. And the breadth of these partnerships is worth capturing as it demonstrates the scope of knowledge exchange activities and the potential of humanities research to have a significant impact on organisations and individuals operating within and beyond the cultural, creative and heritage sectors. So, for example, over the last 10 years, projects have developed meaningful relationships with museums, galleries, libraries and archives, media companies, the education sector, journalists, writers groups, businesses and industry, policymakers, festivals and venues, military regiments, religious institutions, arts collectives, and so on. It's no means exhaustive, but it gives us an indication of the breadth and potential impact that humanities research can have on different communities of interest. So for today's webinar, we've organised activities into 3 sections. And first, we'll have a presentation from Dr. Craig Hamilton on some of the work he's been carrying out on behalf of HERA on models of knowledge exchange, looking at a 10-year period of knowledge exchange and impact. Then we're going to hear some short case study presentations from projects working on the current joint research programme, Public Spaces, Culture and Integration in Europe. And we're going to hear from projects about the challenges of developing collaborative partnerships under lockdown and socially distanced conditions. And this will lead to a discussion between our panelists. And with this in mind, we'd invite you as guests to please contribute questions and comments via the chat box on Zoom here. We normally have a Q&A plus chat, but we're urging everyone please to use the chat only and address your comments to the panel. That will be great. My colleague Alicia Greenway will be monitoring activity as the webinar progresses. This webinar, as you've probably already seen, is also going to be recorded and made available on the HERA website for subsequent follow-up and viewing. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Craig Hamilton. Craig is a research fellow at the Birmingham City University, where I'm based, and whose primary research explores contemporary popular music reception practices and the relationship between popular music and the role that digital data and internet technologies play on the kind of business and cultural environments of music consumption. Since 2019, Craig's been working alongside myself, Jo and Alicia to collate and analyse data on knowledge exchange and impact from the first 10 years of the HERA programme. And today he's going to talk about some of the interim findings from this work. So welcome, Craig, and many thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Tony. I'm just going to share my screen and get some slides up. So hopefully, if you can bear with me for just a second. Can everybody see that? Does that look okay? So thanks for the introduction, Tony. Yep, as he said, I've been working with Tony, with Jo, and with Alicia over the last 18 months, 2 years, looking at the history of arts and humanities research through HERA's projects. We're interested primarily in how knowledge exchange works within the humanities, and our aim with doing this research is to kind of help drive excellence in humanities work, I guess, by exploring how humanities work occurs in practice. Our motivation has been to identify and develop ways researchers can approach it in better and more useful ways. So by providing researchers with the tools and knowledge to undertake their work more effectively, we're aiming to provide a mechanism for producing work that is not only of huge benefit and is high quality, but also may perform better within the sort of broader measurement agendas and contexts that we now often work within. So to achieve this, We've been examining 10 years worth of HERA data. This data covers a range of research activity in several subdisciplines of the humanities undertaken by researchers such as yourselves across Europe. We're working with a mixture of quantitative and qualitative data, which variously takes the form of metrics associated with funding, publications, career progression, networks, responses to researcher surveys, project reports, and interviews. We're hoping to highlight best practice in the form of case studies and to produce a suite of resources to support future HERA projects and arts and humanities projects generally. So considering all of this, the logic of what we've been trying to do in this particular piece of work is that in the first instance, there's a sort of a sense, both anecdotally and in the wider literature, that humanities is often poorly placed to succeed within the mechanisms of measurement around impact and so on. However, our position was that if attention is only focused on the ultimate outcomes of knowledge exchange processes, i.e. high impact research, high scoring research, then it will not be possible to improve the processes that lead to those outcomes. Rather, we suggest that it's a primary focus on the processes themselves that will help drive disciplinary excellence, because if you can produce excellent work, it sort of logically follows that it will be high-performing research as a secondary and logical consequence of that. So today I'm going to present some initial findings from the work that we've been doing, and it can be boiled down really to three simple questions. The first being, how do arts and humanities research projects map on to some existing models of knowledge exchange, transfer, and impact? The second question is, what can this tell us? And the third question being, how can that knowledge that we've discovered help us drive excellence across the arts and humanities more broadly? So in order to undertake this work, we first looked at some models for evaluating knowledge exchange, knowledge transfer, and impact. The first model under consideration is Paul Benowith's Traceability Upscale model, which some of you might be familiar with. This was developed in order to examine how scholars have been reacting to the diverse impact and public value agendas that I've just mentioned earlier. He argues that in areas of scientific research, there's a valorization model that creates a heuristic, the logic of which runs through three stages. Universities and firms interact with supply chains and competitors. This produces economic benefits more widely. Therefore, the argument for investment logic in research is made. Benowith wants to question the notion that the discursive power of this argument maps poorly onto arts and humanities research. So to test this, he mapped arts and humanities research onto his model to ask three questions. Do arts and humanities academics engage with efforts to ensure that their work has impact? And he found that the answer to that question is yes, they do. They're not so different from their science counterparts in that regard. The second question was, do they and their universities attempt to transfer knowledge and other benefits to stakeholders in the creative and cultural economies? And the answer he found to that question was also yes. The literature and the reports that he studied suggested that that's an activity that happens very broadly. And then the third question being, is there a wider good developed? And again, he found yes, because the humanities deals in the complex and provides the language for understanding the contexts in which things like scientific research can and do have impact. So arts and humanities research maps well onto the overall logic, but he says has not to date been linked up discursively to demonstrate humanities research's traceable upscalability. So in the absence of a coherent narrative that demonstrates traceable upscaling, there is a flattening out of claims for arts and humanities research impact that prevents the emergence of an investment logic or policy discourse relevant to the humanities. However, he argues that if you can create a similar heuristic, you can make a similar case. He suggests something along the lines of, in the first process, knowledge is transformed in ways allowing it to be useful, involving both researcher and user in that transfer process. In the second process, that knowledge is codified and circulates in a wider set of networks, creating a series of discrete beneficiaries. And in the third process, the discrete benefits ripple out and are consolidated in new capacities for society, thereby driving wider social development. He also, within his model, has another element to consider, which he calls wicked issues. Now, wicked issues can be understood along the following lines. It's the question of what if the networks that help circulate the knowledge are part of the problem or are not obvious. So part of our work as humanities researchers is sometimes uncovering what the problems and barriers are. Second question being, what if the impacts are the result of luck or the results of trying many different avenues and methods? And as we know in humanities research, part of the research is uncovering what those avenues are. And the third question is, what if research is built on more previous research that is invisible? So it's about showing that research also has a societal value. So I think some of these sort of three questions will be broadly familiar to us as humanities researchers. But we wanted to flesh out that little bit. So in an attempt to flesh that out, flesh out how we can examine HERA work, we also incorporated another model alongside Benowith's. Ward et al.'s work is essentially dealing with the same problems as Benowith, but from a social sciences perspective, and by looking in particular at work in the arena of mental health. They focus much more on the process rather than in the generation of an overall heuristic, and as such, it's a useful model for our purposes when combined with Benowith's. They begin with a basic conceptual model that was, similar to the Benowith model, fairly linear. Research leads to knowledge, which in turn is beneficial. But ultimately, they demonstrated how the knowledge transfer process they observed was non-linear due to the complexity and back and forth involved in the process itself. They found that knowledge exchange can be understood as a dynamic and fluid process which incorporates distinct forms of knowledge from multiple sources. So our methodology in this process has been to examine HERA projects according to a combination of these two models. Combining the two models gave us the following, with the addition of a small number of new elements. In the traceability upscale model, which is model 1 here, we've added 2 intermediate stages that attempted to account for the detail of how projects work with their partners and how their engagement work then extended beyond that on its way to a broader public good. And in model 2, we incorporated the concept of wicked issues from model 1. So our hybrid model was thus sort of balanced across the two models and meant that when we examined HERA project reports, each extract that we took from a report could be given a score of 1 to 5 for each model and classified as a wicked issue or not for each model. We then moved on to 6 HERA projects taken from the first 10 years. And they were projects that spanned across disciplines such as archaeology, history, musicology, anthropology, gender studies, and so on. And in each case, we took the project's final report and pulled out extracts from those reports. Our criteria for selecting extracts was as follows. It had to be information that related to new knowledge generated by the project and the processes through which that new knowledge emerged. It had to be information related to collaborations and knowledge exchange work with organizations and individuals external to the project, or it had to be information related to how new knowledge generated by the project and or through outreach and knowledge exchange work was then utilized by others or shared by the project with the wider community. Briefly, the process that Alicia and I went through in getting these extracts was that we worked independently to pull the extracts from the 6 reports. And we found that from our initial first pass, 45% of the extracts we pulled out were the same ones. We then examined the remaining 55% and agreed to retain the majority, which left us with a pool of 961. We then worked independently and allocated those scores of 1 to 5 or wicked issue for each project. And for 37% of extracts in model 1 and 45% in model 2, we actually allocated the same score. And for the remaining 20%, we renegotiated scores that matched, but that left us with 30% where we differed by only 1 point. And this is the area where we started to delve a little bit more deeply. Doing this work gave us a further version of our hybrid model, which had new elements called, which we provisionally called hinterlands. Now these accounted for the extracts on which we couldn't agree, and sort of fell between the two stools. And our sort of rationale was that it's in these blue areas, the extracts that fell into these blue areas, where we might find the detail of the processes that aren't covered by these existing models of impact and knowledge exchange. So in essence, the extracts fell into two categories: those that were closely aligned with existing models, those that were not closely aligned with the existing models, and either of which could be a wicked issue. So the final allocations across the 6 projects are shown here as percentages, and essentially roughly 72% of the extracts across the 2 models that they fitted within the existing models, and around 28% across the 2 did not. And it's on those extracts that we then did a further and deeper analysis. When viewing these extracts in their 4 distinct areas across the 2 models, we can broadly define the activities and processes as being related to structure, networking, expansion, potential, with the wicked issues there. So structure is activities and processes related to internal systems, rationales, and philosophy. Networking was processes undertaken to bring people together, coalescing around a project and relating to project partners. Expansion were processes that sought to expand the scope and reach of networks to other communities. Potential was kind of the consequences of all of the above, and processes that were, whilst not impact or knowledge exchange in the strictest sense, nevertheless provided evidence and routes towards sustainable networks and relationships that had the potential to do good things in future. So I'm going to talk in a little more detail now about each of the above and provide some examples from the reports. So in structure, these were related to processes that talk about how project teams were structured internally and the relationships in play, how projects explored the creation and development of networks that coalesced around their work, and there was also some detail around the internal systems projects settled on for communication and sharing of work, and often this involved new technologies. There's a strong sense here also in some projects from the sample of a commitment to non-hierarchical structures in their internal and external relationships, and a sense of trust that useful collaborations and relationships with partners were just as likely to emerge from informal meetings as they were from formally structured ones. This final point is built upon in the next hinterland element around networking, and the sense that productive relationships emerge from the development of both personal and professional relationships, and building on the non-hierarchical structures above, that a diverse team of stakeholders could contribute to the success of a project. Overall, these were processes that helped to develop and foster a sense of trust around the project and develop communities and a broad network around the project. The manner in which projects were then able to reach beyond their named partners and reach new stakeholders were processes that built on that trust. And there were examples of innovative dissemination work, again involving new technologies, a willingness to run with and develop new ideas that emerged through new and existing partnerships. And in a sense that the ideas developed through partnerships as projects unfolded were as strong and as useful as those ideas that the project teams had started their projects with. The potential for projects to continue expanding beyond their endpoint were processes where sustainable networks appears to rest on the willingness of projects to utilize partner networks to reach broader audiences, both in terms of continued research and in the dissemination of their existing work. Here also, processes around a willingness to embrace new technologies in the dissemination were also key, but importantly, there is a sense that the strength and potential sustainability of these existing, new and emerging networks were based on the previous elements discussed here. The sustainability being a product of a willingness to adopt non-hierarchical structures, embrace new technologies, be flexible in approaches to the development of stakeholder networks, and so on. In terms of wicked issues, these fell into two camps. There are the positive elements around serendipity that came about through projects being in the right place at the right time. But it should also be said that often this was a direct or indirect result of the activities described above. So they put themselves in a position to be lucky, if you like. And the negative elements, such as unexpected change in terms of team members, changes in team members or localized political upheaval. Common to both types of wicked issue, however, was an ability or a willingness to respond in agile ways to these developments. And again, this comes down to process. So bringing it all together, this is our current sketch for a sort of an alternative complementary model of KE processes in humanities work, illustrated by some of the keywords I picked up on there. Now we kind of see this as a model in progress that can either act as a kind of a complementary or scaffold model to some of those existing models that I talked about earlier. And it's in these areas where our research will now sort of focus on, because we want to speak further with project PIs, ask them to comment and reflect on the findings that we've come up with. And this, along with sort of further work on additional projects, will help us to first of all continue to hone that model, but also based on that, more importantly, from the materials generated through that further research, we want to move towards the production of resources similar to the knowledge exchange and impact toolkits we produced in 2020 that can help HERA projects and humanities researchers think about how they might work in informal ways, or have non-structured hierarchies, or adopt these new technologies. Because it's these sort of processes that we've seen that seem to underpin the knowledge exchange work that HERA projects have been engaged with. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to contact me about this work, feel free to get in touch. And in the meantime, in the discussion, any comments, questions or suggestions would be most welcome. Thanks very much. Me.
Great, thanks very much, Craig. I'm sure there's a lot to pick up on there in the discussion going forwards, and a really rich data set to sort of start thinking about. We'll come back to it, I'm sure, when we have that question and discussion session. But now I'd like to move to the next part of the webinar, where we introduce some of the case studies and some of the really interesting work that projects in the Public Spaces programme have been doing in terms of knowledge exchange. Now, of course, as we all know, the last year and a half has been really different. COVID has forced projects and researchers across the globe to really think about how they conduct knowledge exchange. And that has produced a series of challenges to the ways that people go about their knowledge exchange processes. So whereas once we might have developed that trust that Craig was talking about by face-to-face relationships, we've all been forced to move online. Many projects have also been forced to reconfigure or look again at their knowledge exchange activities, and to work through the digital world, adapt in new ways. Projects have also, in that sense, had to think about the publics that they're addressing differently, because even if the challenge of knowledge exchange has been sometimes quite great, the opportunities for knowledge exchange in the digital world have also been commensurately large. The ability to talk to other people on the other side of the world in different time zones, to expand those audiences and publics, people to talk to, opportunities to speak to people, to create knowledge exchange have increased as we have worked through the digital in new ways. So that both the challenges and the opportunities are things that our projects are going to pick up on, and the range of ways in which they've been working with partners, I'm sure will be really, really interesting for us to hear. So I'm going to pass over to the projects now. We have 5 different projects represented, and we have all career stages within projects also speaking today, which I think is a fabulous, fabulous thing. It's really important that we get young researchers also engaged in knowledge exchange. But I'm going to start off by handing over to Phil Withington, who's the project leader for the Intoxicating Spaces project and who is based at the University of Sheffield. Phil, over to you.
Oops. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Craig, for that overview, and to Marina and Rose for organising this. I think I've just selected the wrong screen. Is that working? I seem, yes, it is, sorry. Okay, so great. What I'll do, I'll just explain Intoxicating Spaces briefly, what we were planning to do and how it's structured, and then I'll move on to the challenges we've faced and how we've dealt with them and the contingencies and so on. Can everybody hear me? Is that okay? Yeah. So what we're looking at is the impact on urban public space of the introduction of new intoxicants into Northwestern Europe between the 17th and the 19th centuries, and kind of what we can gain from a historical perspective in understanding current issues relating to public space. We're interested in space in the kind of Northern Baltic Sea as a trading region and its developing relationship with transatlantic world, so a kind of global dynamic with the urban systems at the center, but also the micropolitics of spatial interactions and consumptions that happened within cities because of these, the introduction of these commodities. We've got 4 research teams comparing the dynamics of new intoxicants in public space in Amsterdam, Hamburg, London, and Stockholm between 1600 and 1850, when some intoxicants became normalized and popular, such as tobacco, coffee, tea, and sugar, and some were, if you like, denormalized in that kind of framing, and heavily regulated, such as opiates and alcoholic spirits. So the knowledge exchange activities that we were originally planning, I suppose it's important to remember this is a short 2-year project with 4 researchers in the research teams of Oldenburg, Sheffield, Stockholm, and Utrecht, working intensely to do original research and engage in knowledge exchange and knowledge creation programs. And these programs were local projects with schools feeding into an international conference in Amsterdam for all 4 research teams and their school partners in October 2020. Working with museums in each of these contexts, and the creation of a virtual exhibition research tool that will be based on a new scraps methodology, I think, which has been introduced at a previous webinar. Some national interactive initiatives unpacking the contemporary relevance of the historical perspective on intoxication, working with NGOs and UN Habitat and institutions like that. And also transnational initiatives also bring the past to bear on the present. And in terms of the challenges and contingencies, we were lucky to hit the ground running in July 2019. So we kind of started very quickly because of our short research time. And by the time COVID became an issue in January 2020, our research teams were already working closely with their respective schools and museums and feeding into the virtual exhibition. So things were already up and going. We were also lucky to have extremely committed and determined partners, especially teachers and students, who were flexible and, to use the language of Craig, agile and determined in terms of meeting the challenges of lockdown. And a few of our research teams, when I mentioned I was giving this little talk, wanted to stress that after the initial panic of COVID, which was significant, it was quite remarkable how quickly people did start to adjust and start to try and work out how you could reach kind of endpoints in the new circumstances. But I think most importantly, and as Jo was kind of mentioning in her little introduction, the online was really significant, and we were quick to embrace the realities of online communication and digital resources. And we actually already had a strong online presence when COVID struck. We had, I mean, to give some context, we've got over 3,000 Twitter followers that have given 1.5 million impressions. We've had 44,000 visitors to the website since it went up 18 months ago. So we already had quite a good online presence, and this was something to build on. So for three of our research teams, museum activities were postponed when the museum shut, and these activities were now picked up again, and that was with Utrecht, Sheffield, and Stockholm. And Oldenburg was actually able to push through its activities, many of online, through their close relationship with the Maritime Museum in Bremen. All four research teams were able to shift their national school projects online and continued working with schools, although it was difficult, and we were able to do that. The International Schools Conference was postponed to January 2021, and that was moved online. And this proved a real triumph and a real morale boost, actually, for the whole project, with 80 plus teachers and pupils participating in a 3-hour event, and students contributing blogs subsequently as well. And the 6-month extension from HERA, who I have to say were fantastic in terms of helping us cope with all the problems, enables us to postpone the completion of the virtual exhibition and the national international activities with the museums and NGOs and do that work once restrictions were lifted. So there was a lifting of restrictions last summer. The lockdown came back and we had to pull back, but we're obviously able to carry on again. So that kind of extra time was really, really important. And then finally, we have an international conference, which was moved online as well. And that's actually attracted more registered attendees than it probably would have done anyway. We're well over 100 plus 30 plus speakers as well. So in terms of the benefits, apart from a bigger conference and so on, what we found with the kind of online emphasis was there was better communication between the research teams through weekly online meetings. We'd initially kind of filled in sort of a few monthly sessions at our different locations, our universities, but obviously with the online, we were able to meet every week, and that's been really, really good for coherence and coordinating activities and coping with the problems. We developed a fortnightly online seminar called What's Your Poison, which attracts 100 plus each fortnight, and there's over 500 individual attendees. The reallocation of unspent travel money, which was really significant actually, has enabled this final tranche of activities of exhibition, events, museums and NGOs. We actually found a new and important additional research theme on intoxicants, spaces and play, which has led to conference panels and also an extra co-authored academic article. And obviously there's kind of quite a lot of follow-on stuff you can do with that in terms of practical responses to pandemics going forward. And we've also plans to apply for a follow-on funding to develop a new online summer school with the schools to try and develop a legacy and hopefully fit that with some MOOCs or a MOOC, which will provide a kind of sustained hub through which further networks with schools and teachers can continue. So I hope I got in that in time. Sorry if it was garbled. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Phil. That was great, and I think actually quite inspiring in terms of being able to engage school kids and teachers at a time when we know so many children have been isolated. Actually giving them the opportunity to engage in a research project, I'm sure has had enormous benefits in a variety of ways. So I'm really keen to hear more about all those kinds of interactions in the discussion as we go forward. But now I'd like to pass on to the next presenters, Thomas Muguer and Georgiana Cutson. Thomas is an early career researcher in Paris at the Centre Alexandre Koyré, and Georgiana is an early career researcher at the University of Maastricht, and they are both members of the Scientific Conference Project. So over to you.
Okay, let me share my screen. Yes. Hello, everyone. Toma and I will be talking to you today about fiction as knowledge exchange in history through our own attempts to communicate the experience of being a conference participant in our project. So our project SciConf is studying the history of scientific conferences in the late 19th and 20th century. And we conceptualize conferences as public spaces that are a phenomenon to be studied by itself and not just a background for other types of actions. Conferences are, in a sense, sort of knowledge exchange process themselves, since they always involve and are addressed to hybrid publics. They have been used historically as models for democracy or as formative processes in how we interact in public spaces. And of course, they've been communicating the public image of science and the public figure of scientists to broader audiences. So our knowledge exchange practices had two purposes. The first one was getting in touch with scientists and practitioners, mainly conference organizers. We've been doing that by organizing a workshop in which we discuss the relevance of our work with active scientists and scholars, supported by the Royal Swedish Academy, one of our project partners. We've been engaging in the ongoing discussion about the future and usefulness even of conferences through op-ed articles and the preparation of a policy paper. And we try to interact with conference organizers, take interviews, and plan an upcoming workshop with one of our other partners, the Lawrence Center, a conference center in Leiden. Our second goal was getting in touch with the broader public, and we plan to do that with a closing conference on conferences at the Science History Institute in Philadelphia, which is quite active in engaging the public in the history of science discussions. And we were also planning to have walking tours in Paris in sites of importance for scientific conferences, and also a collaboration with the visual artist Mariana Castillo de Bal to prepare an exhibition. So these last two processes were kind of limited because of the pandemic, and we decided to transform them in order to have a bigger outreach. So we thought that the measures for the pandemic would really limit the outreach of the walking tours, and maybe they wouldn't even be possible. And we also wanted to find a form of collaboration with Mariana that could be done digitally, because planning an in-person exhibition digitally is kind of difficult. And our solution is something that Thomas is going to tell you about.
Thank you, Georgiana. So foreseeing that it would not work out, we decided instead to merge both initiatives into a single project. So together with Mariana, we are now working on the production of a podcast series. The goal is to capture the historical experiences of conference participants through first-person narratives. There will be semi-fictional accounts. Each will be based on archival material and tied into a narrative through fiction writing. They will be enhanced by spatial, visual, and audio materials, such as interactive maps and pictures. And the goal is to produce 4 10-minute long stories. With each, we intend to stage a specific conference type and a particular dimension of the practice that we have researched. So for instance, one of them will highlight the rituals and informal exchanges organized and performed in the case of the Gordon Research Conference in Chemistry that were held in the mid-20th century. We also plan to design a podcast where we want to imagine the post-COVID conference to depict the experiences and display the practical implication of the digital turn the practice is taking right now. We are also looking into organizing a public launch of the podcast at the Philadelphia Science History Institute in the fall of 2022 in the form of performance with actors. Besides the fact that the podcast accommodate the limits imposed on us by the pandemic, we believe this collaborative work of fictionalizing our research enacts the idea of knowledge exchange as a co-production rather than a mere dissemination process. So a co-production where Mariana's artistic outlook on science, or competencies in visual arts, and a sensitivity for historicity are crucial inputs in producing fiction, translating research into narratives, and in turn make us think differently of our object of study. So there's a real give and take dimension going on. Fictionalizing our research has multiple benefits for us as researchers. It allows to fill the gaps left by patchy archival sources and accounts. It allows also to mobilize resources that research practices tend to marginalize, such as the rich visual material produced by conferences, such as pictures. And then fictionalizing is also a form of investigation. It has the potential to yield certain insights, to bring in view a certain truth that is overshadowed by our tendencies as researchers and historians to focus more on the collective experiences rather than individual ones. And in return, this podcast series is practically better in terms of public outreach. It strengthens the outreach of the project by making the study of conferences more relatable, as the format will be particularly immersive. It will also have a broader impact than the works, as it will be permanently available for everyone through the website, and also its impact might be more measurable as well. Furthermore, it participates in the demystification of science by highlighting the mundane, human, and public dimensions of elite scientific meetings. The podcasts work as a window into the everyday inner workings of science, and in so doing, contribute to challenge the public's ignorance and rising skepticism that is threatening science and the humanities today. Opening up the scientific conference also contributes to questioning broader and generally relatable dimensions for everyone, such as the notion of presence, of togetherness, the sense of community that have been shaken by the pandemic. And finally, these peculiar pandemic times, which have shut down for long any form of collective gatherings, and in particular the conference, these fictional accounts catch an answer to a question that many are currently asking themselves. Why do we still have conferences after all, and why do we crave to have them back? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Thomas and Georgiana. Again, lots to think about there. I'm really struck by this idea of co-production and how that's making you think differently around your own work and giving you new kinds of insights. And that's really, at the heart of knowledge exchange, isn't it? That what you're doing by working with your partners creates this kind of reflexive relationship to your own research. So yeah, again, lots to pick up on. I'll pass over now to Katie Young. Katie is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Limerick, and she is part of the Night Spaces project. So Katie, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you very much for having me. So I am part of the Irish Night team, along with Dr. Elva Kenny, who's leading the Irish Night team. And just a little bit about Night Spaces very briefly. It's a transdisciplinary collaboration focusing on 8 cities that you can see here. And the project works to understand night spaces and how they're dynamically produced, imagined, experienced, and narrated by migrant communities in Europe. The project is led by the University of Leiden in collaboration with teams across Europe that you can see here. Within the Irish Night project, Elva and I focus on how African migrant, diasporic, and Black Irish musicians experience music making in night spaces. More specifically, we explore musical experiences in the cities of Cork and Galway, which you can see with the stars here, situated on the West Coast. As part of the Irish project, we plan to organize a community-led participatory event that included musical performances from musicians who are a part of the research project. The event was meant to be in collaboration with Galway City of Culture 2020, which was a year-long celebration, including arts and community events in the city. And you can see quite a vibrant poster for Galway 2020 here. Galway 2020's official opening ceremony and their early events coincided with the beginning of our fieldwork project, which began in January 2020. So we had about 2 months of research before the pandemic. So as you can see in this picture on the right, we actually met with Galway 2020 and we discussed ideas about the community event, including possible venues and also different kinds of support that we might have on the event. And as the initial event was meant to be community-led, we also spoke with musicians who were involved in the research project early on, and each musician contributed unique ideas for how they saw the event shaping up. Ideas included daytime educational workshops run by DJs in Galway, as well as a large outdoor nighttime musical performance with different DJs and food and a fashion show. So that would have been really exciting and a lot of fun. When the pandemic happened, we of course had to radically reimagine what this community event would look like. We were in a unique situation with our partnership, considering that Galway 2020 was also tasked with reimagining hundreds of arts events into online projects as well. So we were in the same boat. In the restructuring of Galway 2020, we were partnered with an organizer who we remained in touch with through regular online calls. However, of course, with the situation in the pandemic, this was at times difficult. For example, there was a period of time in 2020 when the organizer we were working with was temporarily laid off. So there were periods in our partnership where we were on our own, but luckily we were able to come back together in the end. Throughout 2020, both Alva and I brainstormed possible different online projects, and we decided on a web project titled Music Memory in the Night. As part of the project, we invited 4 musicians who we had met during those first 2 months in Galway and Cork, and we asked them to think of one memory they had in their city at night. And once they did, they recorded that memory in an audio recording. We then partnered them with visual artists, and the visual artists listened to that audio recording of that nocturnal memory. And then we asked the visual artists to create an artwork based on the memory that they heard. And we also asked the musician and artist to have a conversation about the memory. So the visual arts participant drew on this inspiration to create the artwork. And you can see one example here of the final design. So it includes the artwork, the audio memory, and also the musician's musical performances as well. We also included a visitor page on the website where visitors can also include their own memories and also images if they like. While we were unable to work physically with Galway 2020 or hold events in person, we were able to collaborate with the team who were themselves reimagining a series of events virtually, so they were open to our ideas throughout. Galway 2020's team were keen to circulate our project, and as such, we were able to reach a wider audience than might have been possible in an in-person event. Beyond our partnership, the re-envisioning of the project had several key benefits. We were able to work closely with the research participants that we got to know in the beginning to understand their musical experiences in a lot more depth than we might have otherwise. We were also able to experiment with new methods that I'm sure we wouldn't have thought of before. And finally, the event still remained participant-led. The musicians led the project by selecting their own memories and recording them, by leading the conversations with visual artists, and also by circulating the project to their own broader networks, who also engaged with the project by contributing their own memories. And you can see on the map here, in terms of engagement and interaction with the website, there was a much broader engagement, and also some of the interactions were linked to the families and friendship networks of the musical participants. So it was great to see a much broader interaction. So this is very brief, but our event and partnership were reimagined, of course, during the pandemic, and the end result was circulated by Galway 2020 to their following, and also the network of musical participants. And as a result, it's had a longer lasting imprint than the original in-person event might have done. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Katie. I think what's really interesting there is you're talking about the depth of engagement. So it's not just the number of people, it's about the quality of the engagement that has also changed as a result of your reconfiguring the project. And I hope that we'll be able to have a conversation around that as well. And I'm interested in how that has led to different kinds of data coming into your project, and how you've been able to use that quality of data in ways that you might not have imagined. So again, that knowledge exchange relationship figuring into research processes and creating this kind of spiral of conversation. But again, that's something we'll maybe pick up on later. Now I'd like to pass over to Malte Gasche, who is at the University of Helsinki, and he is part of the Bestrom project. So Malte, over to you.
Hello, over to me. No. No, hello. I'm Malte. I'm stationed at the University of Helsinki at the Center for Nordic Studies, and I'm part of the Bestrom project. This project explores the cultural contribution to Europe's public spaces of its Romani minorities. I will today speak about our knowledge exchange project, and we had a performance lecture, and through this performance lecture we told the Romani public contribution to the field of the circus. Back here, so this Bestrom project has 4 partners. At the project is led by the University of Sevilla, and then we have partners from the University of Liverpool, Krakow, and Helsinki. And we use this Romani term as a kind of umbrella category for different Romani groups such as Roma, Sinti, Manouche, Gitanos, and others. And the Bestrom project discusses 4 spheres of public space: political forums, music arenas, horse fairs, and the circus. Finland went a little better through the corona pandemic, but we also had to postpone our performance lecture. And we did this performance lecture through the eye, through a life story of a former circus artist who lives nowadays in Finland, over 90, and who has met several families with Romani background in her circus career, and kept also contact with them after she retired from the circus world. This was planned with a circus company, Art Teatro, with Pauliina Räsänen and Slava Folko, who were former Cirque du Soleil artists. And the director, Pauliina Räsänen, is also writing her PhD on circus history, and that made this this collaboration easier, because she understood both worlds, the academic world and the circus world. Plus, she is not only a representative of the new modern circus, she had also given guest performances at traditional touring circuses who have this old circus family background. Here we have this our lady Edith Kleinbart, and this performance was planned with her. It was discussed what we could say, what would be okay within the circus community, and she also said might be better for me, for herself, if we don't say this and that. And then we also discussed about music things, costumes, and at the end of the performance, she was really satisfied, and she also followed the performance on internet. So she still keeps contact with these Romani circus artists via Facebook. The topic was the Romani presence in the circus, and we chose to display two families. One is world famous, is the Sinti family Bouchlione from France, who is operating the Cirque d'Hiver in Paris, the winter circus. And then we took another circus family who played being Indians from Northern America in Finland for almost a decade. And they have strong bonds and ties to the Romania culture and language. And but we rather decided not to openly give this family a name in our performance lecture. Challenges in knowledge exchange, though we had to follow carefully, of course, the corona restrictions in Finland, and until the end of maybe 1 week before we knew we could play in front of the audience. We had also ideas to have it outside, but then there would have been problems with the light, and we could also say we could at the final performance we could also have we had audience, and the audience also participate in the discussion, what was really important for us. But we prepared also arranged also alternative options, and we had a live streaming, and through this live streaming, and I think around 250 people followed and watched our lecture. They were coming via chat also questions, and we could also discuss then with an international audience our performance lecture. This is a picture from our show, and we combined circus acts with our knowledge transfer. We presented our research results, and then we could combine it with the circus atmosphere and with real circus acts. And at the curtain behind, you see the picture of the young Edith Kleinbart, who started this circus with 14. And the Romani circus artists have not left many documents, and there's not very much left in the archives. So with this performance act, what we could play live in front of audience, we could remap and reimagine the impact of this cosmopolitan transnational Roma culture and history. And the audience was really satisfied. And one lady said that she had read a lot of books and also about the circus, but first through our performance lecture, she got to know and she learned the impact of the Romani circus families in this field. Yeah, thank you very much for your attention. There is also, we have also recorded our share screenshot. We have also recorded our performance lecture. It's now on Facebook, and I would like now to give you the link. Is it possible? Type here. Yes. And here you can also see the video of our performance lecture plus the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Malta. That's really, really fascinating. I mean, I think the issues you're raising around speaking languages but understanding the partners and the partners being able to understand you are ones that happen all the time in knowledge exchange projects. And having somebody who can speak to both sides of that and understand where those different people are coming from is really, really critical and definitely enhances the quality of the work. And I'm also really struck by this kind of the final piece that you said around the performance being able to reimagine and remap those kind of cultural impacts of the original performances. And by doing that, to create, I suppose, emotional response as well as intellectual response in your audience, which can then be brought back into the discussion and then back into the research. So, I mean, that kind of work seems to be absolutely critical and really, really fascinating also as a dynamic. So again, lots to pick up on. I'm going to pass over now to our last speaker, who is Avril Madril, who is the project leader of the CEMI project, Cemeteries and Crematoria as Public Spaces of Belonging in Europe, who is going to talk about their work, and Avril's at the University of Reading. Over to you, Avril.
Thanks, Jo. And I'll just see if I can share my screen. Can everybody see that okay? Somebody give me a thumbs up. Excellent, thanks, Jo. I'm here representing the CEMI project, Cemeteries and Crematoria of Public Spaces of Belonging in Europe. And I'm privileged to be representing our team. I think it's about 12 of us in total, drawn from across six European countries. And what I'm going to do is just share a few images and a few reflections. I also feel very privileged having followed this fabulous set of presentations today, some really inspiring examples of innovative public engagement. And what I just want to spend a couple of minutes for our project doing is just talking a little bit about what we intended to do, what we've managed to do, and a little bit about what we're hoping to do in terms of public engagement and reframing, reimagining the forms of public engagement that we can adopt. So our project, in the first instance, was, as with others, designed to be participatory, to centre on participants, to focus on the co-production of knowledge and insights, and then to share those insights across both community groups who had vested interests in cemeteries and crematoria, particularly thinking about migrants and minorities and their experience of cemeteries and crematoria as inclusive spaces or not, as the case may be. And of course, that was one of the things that was really interesting at the outset when we first applied for this project to be part of this public spaces scheme. Some of the reviewers sort of raised questions about cemeteries, crematoria, you know, is this at the heart of public spaces? And of course, for tragic reasons, of course, as in the course of the pandemic, I think people are not asking that question anymore. It's very obvious the way in the roles and the significance of cemeteries and crematoria in, as crucial public spaces. And this has presented us both with opportunities and challenges in terms of public engagement. We don't have to make the argument anymore, but there are challenges in terms of opportunities for engaging publics and the mechanisms for doing so. But from the outset, the project is intended to be participatory. It was also intended to integrate creative methods. So very much at the heart of relationships, alliances between humanities and the arts, thinking about using creative methods not only to share findings, such as through the planned exhibitions that we had built into our project design. So thinking about using visual exhibitions alongside briefing notes and a longer report summarising the findings of the research and the recommendations of the research in very practical ways, using visual methods, particularly through exhibitions and associated activities, such as creative workshops. We had a 3D printing workshop planned, and exhibiting displaying the exhibition in places like galleries and local libraries, community centres, shopping centres, and so on. But also using creative methods as part of the actual gathering of research and engaging with participants, allowing participants a different form of expression. So allowing people to have the opportunity to draw designs of their ideal cemetery space, or to use their creative expression, non-text based expression, forms of expression, using photographs, using drawings, or creative forms of text like poems and so on, and sharing of memories, to actually gather information and create understanding, a richer form of understanding that complemented more traditional research methods, such as interviews and focus groups. And we can see one example here, which is shown on the right-hand side of the screen here, the two images which were part of an event organised by two team members, Sonia Kamek and Mariska Wessendorp from in the Luxembourg case study, where they were able to acquire some space at an existing event, which was a festival of migration, and hold a memorial cafe, which is a little bit like the Death Cafe movement in the UK and North America, where there was an opportunity to bring people together to talk about death-related issues over refreshments, but also to invite people to engage and share their ideas, as you can see in some of the displays, where people added post-its in response to questions and prompts, and left their suggestions and ideas. Now, this was one of the events, public engagement events, one of a whole tranche of public engagement events that we had planned in phase 2 of our project, but unfortunately phase 2 coincided with the beginning of the pandemic. So this Luxembourg event just squeaked through before there were restrictions on public meetings numbers and so on. But most of our other events, similar types of events that worked with minority communities in our 8 case study towns, but also brought minority and majority communities together in conversation through things like cemetery open days with events and workshops and activities and so on. Most of those things, of course, had to be shelved. But this still raises the questions about the way in which we can continue to work with creative methods, both in terms of finding out more about our research topics and also sharing them. And it's been quite inspiring to see some of the wonderful examples that have been undertaken by other projects. But the other thing that's in common with other projects as well is that the project was very much grounded in partnership and engagement with practitioners and policymakers from the design in terms of establishing the research agenda and having key stakeholders as partners for the project. So we were fortunate to have, for example, the Royal Town Planning Institute, who work in the UK, and Republic of Ireland as partners, and the Totzova Funerary Museum in the Netherlands, for example. So there again, examples of linking with practitioners, but also museums as sites of public, existing sites of public engagement and dissemination. I think another point is in terms of reflecting on humanities and humanities public engagement through humanities, is thinking about these sorts of partnerships, but also the colleagues that we partner with as well. And obviously here the focus is on humanities, but it's been very helpful in our project to also have some people who are perhaps grounded more in association with the social sciences and also environmental sciences as well, because again, this gives access to different insights, different intellectual insights, different methods, but also different audiences and the reach of different audiences. So not least of all with our partnership with the Royal Town Planning Institute, for example, obviously cemeteries and crematoria, municipal cemeteries and crematoria, but also to a lesser extent private ones as well, very much at the heart of they are at the heart of the decision-making processes and the future planning for cemeteries and crematoria, planning permission for extensions, etc. But I think it helped having some planners involved in the project team as well, undoubtedly. I think about my colleagues, Katie McClymont and Yasmina Bebejan. But other colleagues include Mariana Knapskog and Tano Priya Uteng, who are based at the Oslo Transport Institute. And on the left-hand side, we can see examples of an online seminar series that they have through the Transport Institute that they were then able to use as a platform to reach an existing network of academics and practitioners and policymakers in the field. And I think this just reminds us of the different ways in which these partnerships and alliances, both within academia, interdisciplinarity within the humanities, but also reaching out to colleagues who provide really useful insights and networks from outside of the humanities, can be very profitable and very fruitful partnerships, but also obviously those non-academic partnerships as well. So a couple of things to mention. Obviously, cemeteries and crematoria have been very much in the news and matters of concern. And one of the things that we were able to do quite early on in the first phase of the pandemic was to draw on this project and also draw on the preceding underpinning projects in order to create a blog, which we put on a website and also publicized through Twitter and other social media platforms, which really focused on what we felt were the key recommendations in terms of diverse funerary needs at a time of crisis, particularly looking at the context of COVID-19 and multicultural Europe. And it was wonderful to be able to draw on our interdisciplinary and international team as translators, and different team members translated this blog with these key points about practice into 4 different languages, which really increased the reach of our findings. And this is undoubtedly the most viewed and visited part of our project webpage. But it was also good that other colleagues were able then to draw on and produce some other subsequent blog posts addressing different aspects of cemeteries, including broader questions about cemeteries and public space that we hadn't immediately envisaged as being part of our project, but in the context of COVID came to the fore. And alongside that as well, just trying to be adaptive and seeking both HERA permission and also getting ethics approval to broaden our remit in terms of our research questions a little bit, so that we could actually, when we were in a moment where it was, although we reached out to people in phase 2 to participants and individual users to try to follow through on our biographical interviews and our focus groups, we did as much as that as we could, as people were willing to do online. But in the context, not everybody necessarily wanted to do that, was in the right place to do that, and not everybody was comfortable with the technology, although that has become slightly easier over the last year. But we refocused and went back to our stakeholder interviews in the first phase of the data collection to gather more information about their experience in the light of the pandemic and the issues that were really crystallized by the pandemic, that we could take forward and share, both in terms of blogs and our longer term policy recommendations or practice recommendations. These were always at the heart of the project, so we had from the outset an intention to produce a longer report, synthesizing the findings from the different case studies, but also to produce local short briefing notes that summarized key challenges for multicultural inclusion within cemeteries and crematoria within the case study, the 8 case study towns that we were looking at, but also to share examples of best practice from the local case studies from the wider region, and also from international case studies from across the project. And we can see the first draft of the first of these coming from Luxembourg. And we'll be bringing these together in, as I say, into a synthesizing report that we plan to present in a launch at the European Commission, and we're going to have to think quite carefully about how and imaginatively about how we do that in due course. But looking forward to exploring that as we go through. So these issues just highlight some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities, and we are looking at exploring other options such as podcasts, different forms of outreach. We are working with designers to transfer what would have been a physical exhibition that was taken back to each of the case studies as part of the feedback to case study communities and practitioners. We're now transferring that to a digital exhibition, but with the hope that that might then still have the potential to be sort of converted, to be materialized in due course in interesting ways when that's possible in due course. So thanks very much. That just raises some of the issues, and back over to you.
Thank you, Avril. Thank you. I mean, you know, in the context of COVID, that work around inclusive public spaces, and given what we know about the impacts of COVID on minority communities, it's so important to hear that work. And I'm sure that the reflections of the project will have you know, impacts for many years to come going forward. But we're always overrunning in these things because people have so many interesting things to say, and I'd really like to bring us into a questions now. So I'm going to bring Tony back in now to help with the questions, and all the panelists, if you could switch your cameras back on, we'll start to go back in. I mean, there's a really obvious question to kind of kick off with, which is about the iterative nature of knowledge exchange. Many of you have talked about how the work that you're doing is making you think differently, and I guess that poses the question I raised for you, Katie, about how is that change in the depth of experience that you're having with your partners reflecting back on the way that you actually research the project and construct the project?
Sure. One thing that I guess I didn't anticipate about this initial event and then online project was that it made me reconsider methodologies, and actually through thinking through the project afterwards, the depth of information from the memories and from the artwork, I think, really instructs researchers to learn from participants in new ways and cross arts interdisciplinary ways. And I actually just submitted an article exploring this idea of inter-arts methods based on this event. So it's really kind of encouraged me to think about how researchers can be guided through these cross-arts collaborations.
Lovely. Right, Phil, would you like to take the wheel? You've got your hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Just on the iterative nature and kind of how KE affects research. It was working in a few ways with us, I think. In the first instance, like working with the different schools in different countries, the pupils brought particular research questions that they were interested in within the broad area of intoxicants and space and public space and so on. And particular themes became very important because they were important to them, such as the exploitative nature of the production and supply of intoxicants. So slavery was a big issue for the kids. The gender dynamics and politics of public space was very important, and that kind of directed our own thinking in terms of what we're doing. There was specific examples. There was a brilliant little blog by some Dutch pupils about tea in the Netherlands in the 18th century, which kickstarted a whole tranche of research on tea gardens across the 4 countries. So there was that substantive contribution. And I think because they were engaged as well in the creation of the virtual exhibition in terms of identifying materials that we directed to them in a general sense, they had that input too in creating the virtual exhibition, which will hopefully then be culminating in a process whereby they start to use the exhibition going forward. And I suppose also in terms of the NGOs and so on, and policymakers, there was the whole issue of COVID itself and the relationship between sociability, COVID politics, and intoxicants, which really reorientated some of our thinking in terms of our key academic contributions and to kind of the public debates going on. So there was lots of ways actually. It's been very exciting because it has developed as it's gone along. It's been very iterative in that sense. I think it's one of the great benefits of this kind of project.
Yeah. Would anyone else like to jump in? Other thoughts? No. I mean, Malta, I'm really interested.
Hello.
I'm really interested in your response from the Roma community to your work.
Yeah.
To, change the way that you viewed what you were actually doing, and this way that you talked about things that we should say or things we shouldn't say. Could you elaborate maybe a little bit more on that?
This Edith, she is part of the circus community, and even if she is 90 and has sold all her animals, but she is not Roma. She has met these Roma people. They were part of this environment, of this multicultural environment. But she knows also the language of this silent, of this secret circus language, where a lot of Roma words are in there. But she's still part of this community, and she speaks on Facebook with the Roma artists who are now in the US, and she knows what is possible to say and what what's not going, what's better not to say, because still these Roma entrepreneurs, they fear that they maybe don't get, when they are on the fairground, that they're not allowed longer to come, or even they fear for their lives. And sometimes, and then there are other families who are saying right away, okay, we have this Romani background, and they're really offended. They're saying this, and this is part of our history. And other families, even when they were in Auschwitz, they don't want to speak about that. So, and this was really important for us, that we integrate them in our research. And even when we did our research on and published our articles, so I phoned them and I was in contact with them, which was a little bit more difficult, because I thought I go with them, I'm going on the caravan site, and I met them face to face. This is easier. But for example, I couldn't write them, because they can't simply write and read part of them. So they still say, oh, this is not part of our cultures, when they are acting as North American Indians. So they're doing it as an Indian, say it's not part of our cultures, but actually they can't, it's part of the Roma culture, they can't read, write. But this is really important. And it was also for this 90-year-old woman really important, and she knew the codes. And that she got integrated in that, and that we integrate also the community. And what I have heard also, that they really liked the idea of performing, because they don't go to museums, but when they see this on Facebook, and then they are known, and then they are also proud. When we wrote our articles, then there were also some mistrust at the beginning, but then they were also quite proud that somebody is writing about them, that they were in America, they were part of Sean Connery, they're in James Bond movies as high wire artists, and you know what I mean? But nobody knows this, and nobody writes this down in the family. But then they contributed by themselves the information.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting as a way of creating bridges, creating trust that then feeds back into the research work. And
when we speak about these museal works, you don't have any objects, because you don't have documents, and you can imagine when they don't read and write down things, they don't write books. If a caravan burns, a circus tent burns, happens until today. Everything is gone. Everything is lost. Costumes are lost, and even costumes. They are changing the costumes because the other foreign generations have to wear them. Then they are modifying them. There's nothing left. But and for this reason, I said we could really remap and reimagine this sphere of the Romani presence. And for example, a museum exhibition, it's difficult to that you get this feeling.
Thank you, Malte. I want to move on to another question that we have now, which is actually from the funders' perspective. So as researchers, we know that knowledge exchange is an iterative process, and what you've all shown very beautifully is that it takes you down unexpected avenues. And some of those avenues were forced, in this case, by COVID. So perhaps the kind of changes were slightly more dramatic than one might otherwise have experienced. But I think everybody who's engaged in a knowledge exchange project has at some point had to move in a direction that they didn't think, because that's how knowledge exchange works. So how can funders support this iterative nature of knowledge exchange? Because of course, when you write a project, you have to say what you're going to do. But the nature of knowledge exchange is that you never quite know how it's going to work out. So would you like to comment on that? Give the funders a steer as to what you think would be a good way of supporting you.
We've got Avril that's got a bit of a response to that.
Go on, Avril.
Hi, no, sorry, I'm not sure it's a response to that. It was a different point. It was a different point about our partners being under financial pressure, Joe. But I do think that the longevity is the deep roots and continuity is really important in terms of ongoing public engagement. But I'd love to hear some more from the other projects.
I wonder here whether Craig, I mean, a lot of this resonates, I think, with the processes and the models of KE that you were outlining before, the things that sort of fall beneath the cracks, and and is there a way of capturing this so that funders can kind of acknowledge that, the processes of KE and the iterative nature of the work?
Yeah, there's certainly some examples from ones that we looked at, and one of the projects, certainly their data collection, for example, spiraled almost out of control the moment their network started to expand. So having, as Joe said, initially sort of set out to work in official archives and places like that of towns and cities, once they started doing outreach work about the type of work they were doing, they suddenly found people were coming forward who had boxes of postcards underneath their beds, for example, which, it's a very specific example, but I think that kind of, it's about the agility within the project to be able to kind of go, right, well, we've got a budget, we've got a time frame to work within, but suddenly in our lap, there's this fantastic resource that we didn't know anything about. So whether it's a buffer piece of finance or time, I don't know, that you could apply for, or kind of, you could at least, it seems, and from the work we've done so far and what everybody said today, that this is a sort of thing that happens, so it's I don't think it's unique to the 6 projects we looked at. So it might be some kind of flexibility in how projects are administered, or how funding could be moved around, where a case could be made for something like that there's an adjunct to the project that can deal with these unexpected things that come about through the iterative and the networking. So that the same could go for dissemination as it does for data collection. But yeah, I get there's a fine line, I suppose, between the project becoming something that it wasn't when it was initially funded, which it always does to an extent, but kind of recognizing perhaps that there will be interesting and beneficial things that could happen from allowing perhaps a bit of flexibility towards these things that land in a project's lap, if that answers the question.
Yeah, Craig, I mean, I think that's really useful, because I think what we see with projects when we talk to projects, and what we see in the research reflecting on those 10 years, is that actually understanding the processes that projects are engaged in, as opposed to enumerating the impacts that they have at the end, is the way of really understanding what projects might need. I think it's not just about, well, we did this and we did this and we did this, and now we need support for more. It's about understanding that a process in itself is the important thing. And I think what we've heard from all the projects today is that they're very different processes that each project has undergone, very different partners, but everybody is having to navigate those processes. And it's in the process that the excitement happens, that magic happens in a process. It's not an outcome.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the things that people do that are, I suppose, maybe taken for granted, or not narrated in the ways that reports are set up, or what have you. But you don't find that person with the box of postcards under their bed unless you've gone through this process of kind of thinking about how you're going to communicate to your partners, what you're going to do when you meet with them, and yeah, that perhaps doesn't show up on an itemized project report, if you like. It's those relationships that make that happen.
Yeah, and
it's really, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I'm really struck by the imagination. So what Thomas and Georgiana are saying about the fictionalizing of something that people might find quite dry, that actually makes it a different kind of engagement, a different kind of understanding. And that imagination can also allow you to reflect back. But I'm very struck that we've gone over time now. We could talk about this a lot. So I'm going to hand back to Tony.
Great, Joe. And I'd really just like to, just some concluding remarks, really. Joe and I would love to, like to thank you all, Craig and our panelists, for your inspiring contributions today. And Alicia for the work monitoring the chat. And also like to thank Rose and Marina for their hard work, their tireless work in getting this series off the ground. The work that they do behind the scenes is incredible. And I suppose the webinar itself will be made available on the HERA website shortly, along with previous events. But this is hopefully just the start of a number of initiatives that you will be able to tune into, to read about, and to engage with over the coming months. So please do continue to follow the work of the HERA programme via the website and our social media channels. And again, if you're interested in knowing more about knowledge exchange activities, please check out our toolkit that has some examples of work that's been carried out in the past. And again, keep an eye on the news items within the website itself. So thank you all once again, our panelists, presenters, and you all, our attendees, for joining us this afternoon. And see you again very soon. Thank you. Goodbye.